Get the old record button. Here we go. So we got chapter 3 today. So we're moving forward through your regular NASM, and we are going to be looking at the cardiorespiratory system today. So today it's a little bit less about human movement, and it's going to be a little bit more about how we extract energy from our environment and how we deliver that energy around the body, which is a very fancy way of saying how we get oxygen and then how we deliver that oxygen. So this is kind of fun because it's been a while since we've talked about the cardiorespiratory system. We've been talking a lot about human movement lately, but now we are on to the cardio side of things. What's up, Bay? Welcome.
Hey, good morning.
All right. Technical difficulties are out of the way, I hope. Yeah, what's gonna be ironic is like later today when I go to like take this video and get it rendered and into YouTube or something, it's gonna have like some type of error and be like, yeah, your computer was not up and running, it wasn't recording. I just know that's gonna I'm gonna have to record the evening. Anyway, calling it now. So the purpose of today's lesson, we want to have a pretty good understanding of the cardiorespiratory system. Which is sort of another one of those interdependent systems, kind of similar to the human movement system, where it's actually made up of two individual systems, which is why our objectives are to understand the structure of the cardiorespiratory system, but mostly like we're going to be breaking down the cardiovascular system, which is your heart, your blood, and your blood vessels, and your respiratory system, which is your respiratory pump, that's your lungs, and your respiratory passageways, which are all little tubes within your lungs. So we're going to talk about how each of those systems is totally related to our ability to move the entire kinetic chain, but it's a little bit less about anatomy today, and a little bit more about like physiology. So we'll talk a little bit about oxygen testing procedures and relate that to how like dysfunctional breathing patterns do have a pretty big effect on our ability to move the entire system. So there actually is a little bit of posture talk here at the very end, because like your posture can affect your breathing. So it does kind of come back down to that. But looking firstly here, just kind of giving us a broad overview. If we're talking about the cardiorespiratory system, what we're talking about is this is going to be comprised of your cardiovascular and your respiratory systems coming together. So this is another, like I said, it's an interdependent system where it relies on both of these other ones working. It's responsible for gathering and delivering oxygen throughout the body, right? So we're lumping the heart and lungs together, but it's kind of funny because like if you think about like how the heart and lungs function, they're not at all similar. Like your heart is just a pump that generates and maintains like blood pressure, and it pumps blood around the body. And the oxygen is just, the respiratory system is in charge of like extracting, oxygen from the environment and handing it off to the cardiovascular system. So really your respiratory system ensures that like your cells get to stay alive, but your cardiovascular system ensures that like those things that are vital for life are actually being delivered. So they definitely work very closely together, even if they are not all that similar. But your cardiorespiratory system, like I said, is going to provide you with oxygen, nutrients, protective agents, and a means by which you're going to remove waste products. Obviously, like waste product can be carried in your blood. Even, like little bits of urea and things like that can eventually get to filtered out of your body thanks to your urinary system, which your cardiovascular system actually also works very intimately with. But also the waste products that we're mostly going to be talking about is like carbon dioxide, right? So we bring in a molecule of oxygen, we use it in order to produce like a little bit of energy, we attach some carbon to it, and then now suddenly it's carbon dioxide, and we get it out of the body by exhaling. So we wouldn't be able to do any of that if we couldn't transport it around. And that's, again, where the cardiovascular system comes in. So Your cardiovascular system is going to be comprised of the heart, which is the pump, your blood, which is sort of like the delivery system, and your blood vessels, which are kind of like the highways that that delivery system sort of travels through. And then you've got your respiratory system, which is your respiratory pump, which are the muscles and framework that allow like the expansion and contraction of your lungs, and your respiratory passageways, which are all of these little tiny little branches that break out smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually they end in these little sort of sacs. And those things are going to be covered in blood vessels. And so that's actually where, thanks to the passageways, the exchange of nutrients is sort of taking place. So if we're looking at our cardiovascular system here, and we break that down first, first thing we're going to talk about is your heart. So one thing that they love to test you on, guys, and this is one of those things that like, it's not necessarily the most applicable knowledge in the world. Like this stuff, it's important to understand how your heart works, because then like you're gonna understand like not only the importance of cardio, but also just like how to apply it effectively, like the way it really should be applied. But they love to test you on like the interworking little pieces of anatomy inside of your heart, like the little chambers and things like that. And unfortunately, that stuff doesn't necessarily come up in the day-to-day world of being a trainer, but we do have some memorizing to do today, for sure. So looking at the heart, like I said, it's a muscular pump. Its job is that it is designed to push blood throughout the body and maintain pressure. So maintaining pressure is really like one of your heart's main jobs. And so like when you look at like these four kind of distinct chambers that we have here, those chambers need to have like valves that are very good at like closing down in order to generate, areas of high pressure and areas of low pressure. And so your cardiac, your heart is going to be made up of specialized cells that we are going to call cardiac muscle or cardiac muscle fibers. And those special cells, they look very similar to skeletal muscle. Like if you look at the difference between like skeletal muscle versus cardiac muscle, you'll see they're somewhat similar. Like you've actually got three different types of muscle fibers inside of your body. You can see if you look at them, right? You've got smooth muscle, which is very, 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 very smooth. That is like the muscles of like your organs and things like that. Even parts of your blood vessels, right? They're very, very smooth pieces of muscle. But if you look at like skeletal muscle, you'll notice it has these big kind of stripes on it. We call those striations, right? You can kind of see these intense little stripes there. And those intense stripes are, what you're seeing, in that you're seeing like a lot of like the actin and myosin, you're seeing like the Z lines, right? So this is the type of fiber, like a skeletal muscle fiber is really good at like contracting like crazy, like really strong. Like your skeletal muscles can lift hundreds of pounds. Well, your smooth organs can also contract, but they're contracting to move like a lump of food from one place to another. It doesn't exactly have to lift a couple hundred pounds. Well, your heart also doesn't have to lift a couple hundred pounds, but it does have to, like I said, generate and maintain pressure. And it does have to be able to squeeze hard enough to get like fluid from your friggin' chest all the way down to your left foot, your right foot, which is like, not exactly close to your heart, and it has to work against gravity up to your brain. So your cardiac muscle fibers are kind of in the middle. They are, you can see they do have striations on them, kind of similar to skeletal muscle, although the striations are much thinner and sort of wider apart. But you'll also notice that rather than being bundled up together, kind of like this, the way we talked about yesterday with skeletal muscle fibers, cardiac muscle fibers are actually kind of interconnected and weaved together, very similar to smooth muscle. So cardiac muscle is kind of like almost a blend between these two. If we think of yesterday, we were talking about type 1 and type 2 fibers. Well, smooth muscle would be like type 0.1 fibers, right? Or 0.0, it's got plenty of endurance, but it's really not going to lift very heavy, right? And then cardiac muscle is kind of like type 1 half fibers, you know, incredible endurance, but definitely not contracting as hard as like skeletal muscle would be. So those are that's your cardiac muscle. It's kind of unique. And you know, the reason these are all interconnected, and actually one other thing that you'll notice, see here, you can see these little like dots that are on your skeletal muscle fiber. So those are actually like little nucleuses. So those are nuclei. And so that's a really good thing, because like those nuclei are going to tell, like, you know, like ribosomes and things like that, how to like assemble. You can kind of see them here, right? And like that's going to tell your muscles like how to grow and do things. Smooth muscle also has some nuclei, because like we actually want to be able to kind of create contractions in kind of interesting little like wave-like fashions, right? And so now we've got a lot of like brains, you know, because that's what kind of the nucleus kind of is, right? It's the command center of a cell. That are able to kind of control different sections of these fibers. But you'll notice that cardiac muscle really doesn't have that. It has, like, you can see there's a little nucleus probably right. I think that's probably what that is. Your cardiac muscle does have nuclei, but there's not very many of them. And the reason is very similar to the same reason why these fibers are kind of tied together and very tightly packed. Unlike skeletal muscle. And the reason for that is because your heart needs to be able to contract simultaneously. When these fibers contract, we want those fibers contracting, or we want, like, you know, when these fibers are relaxing, we want those fibers to be relaxing. We want everything to work together. And if the nucleus is kind of like the brain of the operation, right? We don't want too many cooks in the kitchen, right? Like we don't want, you know, too many, you know, head honchos all disagreeing with each other and like contracting at the same time. Because if that happens, your heart will start to quiver, and then it's no longer creating like a strong signal. So speaking of that heart's signal, we're going to see the reason, one of the ways that it does that, achieves that, is that your cardiac muscle fibers are much shorter and they're much more tightly connected, kind of similar to smooth muscle. And this enables one fiber to stimulate the other fibers. When it contracts, it pulls on the other ones. And all of your fibers have sort of a built-in rhythm to them, because you can actually see it here. There's this big conduction system. There's these little wires, basically, that are running throughout the entire heart. And so they all have this kind of predetermined rhythm, which is your heart rate. And that heart rate discharge is typically, it's about 70 to 80 beats per minute on average. So your resting heart rate's right around 70 to 80 beats in the average person. If that sounds a little bit low to most of you guys here, that makes sense. You got to remember, like, a strong heart means that it's going to have a lower resting heart rate, because it's going to be able to get more work done with less heartbeats, you know. If you have a strong heart, you know, you guys are all here to be personal trainers. Chances are your hearts are in pretty darn good shape. You've probably been very, you know, generally active people. So I always have to bring that up, because I know, like, a lot of times, like, I've had so many students who are just like 70 to 80, and like they'll sometimes like you know, kind of squint at that, you know. But yes, typically it's around 70 to 80 beats per minute. Now, if it's any higher than that, well, then we know that, like, chances are the heart's not in great shape, because it means that it has to pump more often, because it's trying to deliver the same amount of blood, but it's not getting that blood to travel very far. So it has to squeeze more often to kind of make up for it. So looking at this heart's rhythm, which is, you know, very, very, very important to our heart, we've got to talk about, like, you know, we've already kind of put a lot of emphasis on the fact that, like, the fibers are very tightly packed together. It doesn't have very many nuclei, right? And the muscle fibers are shorter. So all of that allows the fibers to work together simultaneously. So you can see the level of importance that we have here when it comes to maintaining a good rhythm inside of our heart. So when we look at your rhythm, when we look at your cardiac rhythm, your heart has a specialized, we call it, conduction system. And it is these fibers that are actually part of your nervous system that are designed, like I said, they're kind of like wires. If you look at, like, heart, if you take a look at your heart here, you'll notice, okay, normally these are drawn in yellow because they're supposed to kind of represent an electric discharge, but I really like this picture. And they're drawing it in blue for some reason. But you can kind of see here, right? All these kind of wires that run throughout the heart. And so what happens is, like, when an electric signal travels throughout this, it's going to make the entire heart beat at a certain time. And that means that all those fibers are going to be recruited simultaneously. And like I said, this is under the control of your nervous and endocrine systems, and so what sort of originates that signal? We'll kind of pull up a different picture here just because it's a little simpler with like the chambers and stuff. Ooh, don't love that though. High quality, please. If you take a look right here, you can kind of see here's the 4 main chambers of the heart, right? You can see this chamber right here, this chamber right here, this chamber right here, and here, right? And so you've got your SA node. Now, this right here is probably the most important part of the heart. This is your sinoatrial node, or your SA node, and it lives right up here in your right atrium. Now, this little node is responsible for controlling your heart's discharge rate. It's in charge of like controlling the rhythm of your heart. This is why this is typically referred to as the pacemaker of the heart. And if we even look up like what a pacemaker is, when you look at a person who has a pacemaker, that's close. Can I see one with the wires, please? Yep. So when you look at this, actually, you'll see when they implant a pacemaker on a person, they'll run this little wire and it goes straight to the SA node, which would be right here. And then it also goes down here as well. But it's designed to sort of, make sure that that heart's rhythm is working the way that it is supposed to. So we term that the pacemaker of the heart because it does set the pace of your heart, right? So what's happening is your SA node is responding to signals from your nervous system. So if your nervous system gets nervous, because maybe it starts thinking it sees something like a wild animal or something like that, or like maybe just start exercising, right? Well, what's going to happen is, your SA node is going to get a signal from the brain saying like, hey, we should probably speed the heart rate up, right? And so then your heart's going to start beating just a little bit faster, or it might respond to chemical changes. If your blood is very acidic, for instance, like let's say, you start walking and then all of a sudden you're going up a hill. Well, now your muscles are going to generate more lactic acid than they did before. And so now that lactic acid's running through your blood. And so, your pacemakers are like, ooh, man, that is some acidic blood, right? And then all of a sudden it goes, all right, well, clearly we must be doing exercise. I'm going to pick up the heart rate faster so we can deliver oxygen a little bit better and convert that lactic acid and get our acidity level back to neutral. So your heart's going to pick up for that reason. Or maybe your endocrine system creates like a little bit of norepinephrine or adrenaline, and then all of a sudden that runs past the SA node. And when adrenaline runs past the SA node, it picks it up really, and makes it start beating faster. If you look at like, this is going to be kind of a gross video, so those of you who are a little squeamish, look away. But let's see here. Acetylcholine. Yeah. Oh, they're going to do it on the rectus abdominis. Okay, normally they do it on the, yeah, okay, here we go. So this is going to be very weird. But if we look right here, remember yesterday we talked about how acetylcholine is this chemical that triggers, it triggers reactions, right? It triggers like a heart to beat, well, or a muscle to contract, right? That's what we talked about yesterday. Well, acetylcholine does the exact same thing in your heart as well. It actually triggers the contractions here. So they've got this little dead frog. This guy's been gone for a long time. But what they're going to do here is he's going to drop a little piece of acetylcholine on here, and that's actually going to stimulate contractions in his heart.
Toxin in here. Hopefully it's fresh.
And so you'll notice you can actually see the heart starts beating, right? These little tiny contractions there. And so that's like a chemical that triggers this to happen. The same thing actually would happen if you started running adrenaline through the heart, which is why if anybody thinks of that, I always say this, but the classic scene from like Pulp Fiction, where like, you know, her heart is stopped and they take adrenaline and they like shoot that big needle into her chest. She's like, right? Adrenaline will also absolutely speed up your heart rate. So that's going to happen whenever any of those chemicals or an electric signal from the brain or a hormone, you know, runs past the heart. It's going to signal the SA node to sort of speed up. So that's your pacemaker of the heart, right? It's located in the right atrium, you know, and it is in charge of kind of setting your heart's rhythm. And then from there, what's going to happen is the signal is actually going to travel down to this little bundle right here, which is called your AV node. That's your atrioventricular node. That's one that they're probably not going to test you on. Like they're definitely going to ask you a question about the SA node. I don't know that they would test you on the AV node, but this kind of delays the signal for a second. So it's kind of funny. We just spent all this time talking about how important it is for the SA node to create this signal. Well, when you look at how it runs, and you're not seeing this little bit here, but you'll notice like there's this little wire that kind of runs this side. When you look at like a heart beating, you will notice it kind of has this rhythm where it's like it goes from top to bottom. It kind of has a rhythm kind of like this, right? And so the reason we want to do that is because we're about to dive into our chambers here, and we want blood to flow through these chambers the way that they are supposed to flow. We want it to rush into this chamber here, into this chamber here, get pushed to the lungs, come back into this chamber here, drop into this chamber here, and then get pumped out to the body. So those chambers, we definitely want to have like, you know, one of those chambers opening up while the other one is contracting, because that is what generates pressure. So that generating pressure is so very, 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 very important, which means we need to maintain this rhythm. I wonder if we can see a heart beating fibrillation GIF. Oh yeah, kind of. Yeah, so here you can see like, you know, top, bottom, top, bottom, top, bottom, right? Over here, we're seeing what is called fibrillation. And you can actually see here's the electric signal, right? It starts and then it goes across the top first, and then it runs. It's kind of hard to see because it's moving really fast, but then it runs down the bottom, right? That electric signal runs down and gets to the bottom of the heart. And that's how we get that, you know, electric signal contracts and then goes here and then it runs down here. But here, look at this. The signal's just traveling all over the place. Electricity is just running wild. And guess what? The heart is just kind of quivering. It's not necessarily contracting really hard or relaxing really hard. It's just doing a little bit of everything. This heart right here is experiencing a heart attack. This is no longer pumping blood anywhere because it's like, you know, no one's getting anywhere because we're not generating any pressure. And so that blood's not necessarily moving out of the heart. So that's why we have the AV node. Your AV node, which is right here, is actually going to delay the signal slightly to allow for the top of the heart to finish contracting before that signal that started with the SA node travels down to the rest of the heart, before it travels down to the bottom chambers of the heart there. And so that is what we're seeing, right? Your sinoatrial node is going to create the signal. It's your pacemaker. Your AV node is going to delay the signal. And then all these internodal pathways and bundles are going to sort of work their way around the rest of the heart to allow for the contraction to happen. And it's kind of funny. You'll look like here, right? There's a lot less, you know, this wire, there's like one little wire up top and then like you know, these 3 little wires right here. But look at how much this branches out. There's actually this little bundle right here. We call it the bundle of Hiss, which is such a cool name. I've always thought I was like, if I ever start like a metal band, I'm gonna call it the bundle of Hiss. But like it, you know, it's this kind of bundling right here that kind of branches out. And then all of these little individual fibers, we call those your Purkinje fibers, right? You can kind of see a different version of that here. So bundle of Hiss, and then that branches out into these Purkinje fibers. All of those pathways interact with all of the little different parts of the heart to allow for a contraction to, you know, really occur and take place there. So that is kind of how your signals work. The SA node creates the signal. That makes the top of the heart contract. Then its signal continues traveling down. Your AV node delays it for just a second so that the rest of the heart doesn't contract. But then once the top is done contracting, now the signal travels down, and that causes the bottom of the heart to contract, which will eject blood away. And the bottom of the heart makes a much bigger contraction than the top of the heart. Even though this electric signal is originating up here in the SA node, the biggest part of the signal is going to be down here, because look at how much more muscle there is in the lower portion of the heart. And we're going to break down in just a second why there is so much muscle there. Any questions on that so far, guys? We feeling good about our heart signals?
Yep.
All righty, cool. So let's take a look at these different individual chambers that we have inside of our heart. So you do have 4 separate chambers here. And I like this version of the picture, but I'm going to look for one that's a little bit more empty. Heart chambers. Yeah, there we go. Actually, there we go. Actually, I really like this one. Okay, so if you take a look here, you can see we've got these kind of different chambers inside of our heart, right? You can see like right here, this is going to be your right atrium. This is your right ventricle. This is your left atrium, and this is your left ventricle. And the atriums kind of look similar. The ventricles kind of look similar. So those 4 chambers there, there's a couple different ways to kind of memorize this. You can kind of memorize it top to bottom or left to right. I don't know which version is going to work best for you, but if you look at the chambers of the heart, we'll go ahead and start by talking about your right atrium. Because technically, if you had a red blood cell and it entered the world for the first time, like let's say your femur, you know, creates a brand new red blood cell, the first time it's ever going to get to your heart is by dropping into that right atrium. So each side of your heart has 2 atriums. And when we think about like what an atrium is, it is a chamber that gathers blood. Like if I look up atrium just randomly on Google here, actually, why did I close that? Keep that open. You know, what we're going to see, it's this big open area. It's this big open area where you gather with other people, right? That's, you know, kind of what an atrium is. So your atriums in your heart, your atria in your heart, that's the plural. Oh, you know what? There's my favorite picture. Is going to gather blood, right? So you're either going to gather blood in the right side of the heart, or you're going to gather blood in the left side of the heart. So those are the atriums, right? And so here what we're seeing is the right atrium is responsible for gathering blood that's returning to the heart from the body, right? And that's why we're drawing this in blue, because this is deoxygenated blood. This is blood that, like my blood cells, you know, traveled down to my calf muscles, gave up all their oxygen. They grabbed a bunch of CO2, and now because they don't have any oxygen in them, the blood it's dark red colored. And then it's going to work its way back to my heart, and then, you know, so that it can get its way to the lungs. So it's going to travel into this right atrium first, and that's the first place it's going to get to before it kind of makes that loop. And for the record, I know we've got this picture drawn in blue, And I know that everybody draws all of these anatomy pictures in blue and red. There is never, ever a time where your blood is blue. Your blood is always, always red. And I know that seems surprising when you look at your veins, but that is simply just the way that red looks when you mix it with this kind of pigment. Your blood is always red. It is either, I guess we could say, it is either dark red or bright red. So if we look at like oxygenated versus deoxygenated blood, you can kind of see a picture. We'll see a little weird looking picture here. It's not a huge difference, but it is one that kind of is distinct, right? You can see this is brightly colored, this is darkly colored. This is the blue. This is the sort of true red there. There we go. You can kind of see that works a little better. So if your blood cell has dropped off all of its oxygen to some body part, well, it needs to get back to the heart before it can pick up any more oxygen because it needs to get to the lungs. Well, what if it's already at the lungs? What if that blood cell needs to get back to the heart so it can get delivered to wherever it's going? Well, that's where your left atrium comes in. So your left atrium is responsible for gathering blood that's returning from the heart. Returning to the heart from the lungs, okay? So you can see I've got blood rushing into my heart from two different spots. It's either returning from my body, and then that's going to go into my right atrium, or it's returning from my lungs, and that's going to go into my left atrium, okay? And so those are your atriums. They're gathering blood as it's returning to the body. And then you've got your ventricles. And ventricles are chambers that pump blood out of the heart. So you can see both of these atriums. The left one is connected to the left ventricle and the right one's connected to the right ventricle. There's this little valve in both of these that are there. And that valve closes down when we don't want blood flowing, and then all of a sudden it opens up and then it closes back down. That's actually what you're hearing when you listen to someone's heart and you hear that like lub dub, lub dub, lub dub sound. You are hearing the chambers. You're hearing these valves open and close. You're basically just hearing them smack on there. So this right atrium right here gathers a bunch of blood. This left atrium gathers a bunch of blood. And then blood's going to rush into both ventricles at the same time. If it's going to the right ventricle, well, that is the chamber that's receiving blood from the right atrium, and its job is to pump blood out of the heart to the lungs. So your right ventricle, because this is deoxygenated blood, where do we want to get it? We want to get it to the lungs so it can go pick up some more oxygen. So when it pumps out, all that blood goes rushing up this tube, and half of it will travel over to the left and half of it will travel over to the right. And it'll go to each of your lungs sort of individually, right? And now that blood is going to drop off all of its CO2, and it's going to pick up a whole bunch of oxygen. Now that blood cell is bright red again. And then it's going to get sucked back to the heart. And you'll see these little tubes here on the side. Those are going to pull that blood into the left atrium, where it will drop into the left ventricle. And the left ventricle is going to receive blood from the left atrium, and it will pump blood out to the entire body. So when you think about like what these chambers are doing, right? Like let's say we look at a brand new red blood cell, not a red blood cell that has already made its trips or anything. We'll say it's the very first time this red blood cell's ever made it to the heart. It is going to go into the right atrium and get gathered, drop into the right ventricle where it will get pumped to the lungs for the very first time. It will pick up oxygen for the very first time. It'll travel back to the left atrium to get gathered by the heart so that the heart can, lump it up together with a bunch of other blood cells and create some pressure. Drop into the left ventricle, and then the left ventricle will pump it out. And that blood cell will either travel up to the brain and drop off its oxygen, pick up some CO2, go right back to that right atrium, right ventricle, lungs, left atrium, left ventricle. And then maybe this time it gets pumped and it travels down the tube all the way to your feet. You're running a marathon, right? And so you drop off that oxygen there and then it goes back. So this blood cell is going to travel from heart to lungs to heart to body to heart to lungs to heart to body over and over and over and over and over again until it gets so worn out that it really can't function anymore. And then it'll end up in your liver, and your liver will basically dissolve it and keep all the ingredients, send those ingredients to your bones, and it'll be remade as a new red blood cell. Your body's very, very good at recycling. So that is sort of how that whole blood flow looks like. It goes right atrium to right ventricle to lungs, to left atrium, to left ventricle, to body, back to right atrium, and then it repeats. So my tip for you guys, because they do love to, these are just the kind of things that make good test questions. You know, like it's very easy to make a multiple choice question out of which of the following chambers is responsible for gathering blood as it's returning from the lungs. You're like, all right, it's coming from the lungs, therefore it must have oxygen in it. If it has oxygen, it must be trying to get out to the rest of the body. The left ventricle is what pumps blood out to the rest of the body. That would be the left atrium, right? Like you can kind of logic your way through those questions. They're just the kind of things that they kind of like to ask. So I honestly, knowing these chambers and having them memorized, honestly, it's not the most handy information in the world when it comes to like a session to session basis, but it is what's going to help you pass your exam. So here's my advice to you guys. The first thing you should memorize is what an atrium is and what a ventricle is. An atrium gathers blood, a ventricle pumps blood. Then pay attention to this piece right here, the left ventricle. As long as you memorize your left ventricle, which is this which is arguably the most important ventricle. Like this is the most important part of the heart other than obviously your SA node. This chamber, you'll notice, is actually more muscular than this side here. Like this side looks a little wider, but this has more like muscle surrounding it, right? This is kind of thin, this is pretty thick, this is really thick as well. So this is the more muscular chamber. Your left ventricle is pumping blood throughout your body. And it makes sense that it's more muscular because again, it has to pump blood against gravity up to your brain. It has to pump blood all the way down to your legs, which are not close to your heart, you know? Your lungs are only a couple inches away. So the left ventricle, or the right ventricle only has to pump it over here. Your left ventricle has to pump it everywhere. So I always tell people, memorize what your left ventricle is responsible for. As long as you remember, like this chamber here is responsible for pumping blood throughout the body. And that's what you're measuring. When you measure your pulse and you're feeling like that contraction of the blood vessel, and you're like, okay, you're counting that beat, you are feeling the left ventricle contract. As long as you remember that, you can remember the rest of them. You're like, okay, well, left ventricle is obviously tied to left atrium. If the left ventricle supplies blood out to the rest of the body, then that's oxygenated blood. Okay, my right ventricle is exactly the opposite. So that must be deoxygenated blood, which means when it pumps, it's going to go to the lungs. And then you can remember that the right ventricle is tied to the right atrium. So my favorite way to memorize this personally is to say, is to memorize your left ventricle first. And then you can kind of work your way from there. Questions on that, guys? Any confusion on the chambers? Sound like it?
No, that was great explanation.
All right, good. Yeah, it can be a pain, man. Like, honestly, the chambers can be kind of a pain in the butt. Can I tell you a personal story? When I was in college, I don't know why I did this, but I must have just missed an explanation. I either wasn't paying attention or I was absent, I overslept, something happened and I had a gap in knowledge and I missed what my teacher said. And, you know, they would just draw the heart with like a black marker on the whiteboard, right? And it took me, like, I was just like, they keep drawing these freaking heart chambers backwards. Because you'll notice the right is here on the left and the left is here on the right in this picture, because it's from the perspective of this person's heart. It's from the anatomic position. And I just remember being just wildly confused by that for like weeks and weeks. And then one day it like clicked and I was like, oh, it's so dumb. Why did I know? You know, and I kind of came to this realization, but I feel like I'll always remember that because it was like this wave of understanding that kind of washed over me where I finally understood. I was like, of course, that's how they drew. That's how they drew everything else in the book, you know. Like, but yeah. All right. So we talked about the chambers, and we're talking about like how the heart is actually functioning. So now we got to look at like how we measure the functionality of your heart. So if we're talking about like, you know, how we are going to be able to kind of slap labels on our hearts and understand how they work, right? You know, the function of your heart is going to be measured by how effectively it is able to deliver oxygen throughout the body. Like, how effective is your heart at delivering blood everywhere it needs to go, right? That's the measure of how functional our heart system is. So there's sort of two things that make up your heart's functionality, right? There's your heart rate, which is how often your heart is beating per minute, and there is your stroke volume, and that's how much blood is being ejected out of the heart. If you've got a heart that's really strong, that can relax, which lets in a lot of blood, and then it can contract like crazy, and it can get all that blood out of the heart, and then it can open up again and let a lot of blood in, and it can contract and get a lot of blood out, right? That means that you've got a really high amount of stroke volume, which means you have a really strong heart, right? So if we think about like those two things coming together, that's how we measure the overall functionality of your heart, or the performance of your heart. And we call that your cardiac output. And so your cardiac output it's the overall performance of your heart. It's comprised of your heart rate and your stroke volume, right? So you can think of this as how much blood is being ejected from your heart per minute. Right? So let's say you are ejecting 10 units of blood per heartbeat, right? So you eject, let's say 10 milliliters of blood per heartbeat, right? Well, if you need to deliver the 50 units of blood to wherever it's going, well, your heart's going to have to beat 5 times in order for that to happen. But let's say your heart just gets a little bit stronger, right? You still need to deliver 50 units of blood, but now you are pumping, let's say, 13 milliliters of blood instead of 10. Well, now in 4 beats, you're going to end up doing, let's see, that's 52 units of blood, and you got it done in only 4 beats instead of 5. So you're able to save like 1 heartbeat, which means your heart rate is going to go down a little bit because your stroke volume has gone up a little bit, right? So you're more effectively delivering the same amount of blood, but your heart's doing less work, So back in the Middle Ages, the belief was that you had a certain number of heartbeats in your lifetime. Like that's what determined how long you lived in this world, bearing like, dying of the plague or, a crazy night coming and, chopping your head off while you're trying to cross a bridge or something, like in every medieval story you read. Speaking of, sorry, totally sidetracked. Have you guys seen the trailer for The Green Knight? It's an Arthurian King Arthur legend. It looks awesome. Anyway, really excited about that movie. Back to what I'm talking about. So back in the Middle Ages, they believed that your heart you had a predetermined number of heartbeats in your lifetime. And so people would say all the time, they were like, you need to relax. You need to be a relaxed person. What's that, Lorianne?
I think it's funny.
Yeah, it's weird, right? Like they were like, remember, like, don't go fast, like don't run. If you go running, your heart rate goes up and you're gonna run out of beats early, it's like you get a heart rate budget, you know?
They tell me that every day. Calm down.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Oh, well, but right. That's good advice, actually. But for definitely different reasons, right? Um, so yeah, like it's kind of funny, right? Like we used to believe. Now, let's just say, for the sake of pure argument here, let's say that that was true. Like it's not, but like if it was true, then you would want to do everything in your power to make your heart strong enough to beat less often, right? You would want to have a really high stroke volume, because if you have a really high stroke volume, your heart's not going to beat that often and you're not going to run out of heartbeats. Now, that's totally not how our heart works. You should absolutely purposefully raise your heart rate in order to train for a stronger stroke volume. Uh, you know, but that's sort of what we think of when we think of cardiac output. It's your overall performance of the heart. Now, they do, NASM does like, or we do like to, not NASM, everybody. We do like to kind of represent this as an equation. So the things that they may test you on, the things you need to know, you need to understand that the cardiac output is the overall performance of the heart. They may ask you that question, or they'll ask you a version of the question, which is like, you know, your cardiac output is comprised of, and it'll be like what? And it'll be your heart rate and your stroke volume. Or you might get a question that says, all right, well, what is your heart rate? Well, your heart rate is the number of beats in 60 seconds. It's how often your heart is beating. And your stroke volume is the volume of blood ejected by the heart per beat. So those two things there are separate concepts, right? One is how often the heart's going. One is how much blood every time. So we have a little equation that kind of represents that. And that is cardiac output equals heart rate multiplied by stroke volume. And so if you eject 10 units of blood every time and your heart beats 50 times, 10 times 5, that would be a cardiac output of 50. And so for some reason, they decided to make this formula, instead of just being CO equals HR times SV, they will often write it as Q equals HR times SV. And that's because Q technically stands for quotient. It's the quotient of blood per minute. So anyway, you may get, you know, the definition of heart rate, you might get the definition of stroke volume, you might get the definition of cardiac output, or they might ask you what the components of cardiac output are. And the components are heart rate times stroke volume. All right. So we are obviously going to monitor heart rate. That's a very important, you know, thing that we do. You know, we want to be able to apply various levels of stress depending on what our clients' goals are, and we need to know, like, you know, what their maximal amount of stress they can handle is. That way, we can work at a percentage of that. So, you know, just like if I knew that you could lift 100 pounds, let's say that's your 1 rep max. And I wanted you to, you know, definitely be guaranteed to complete 12 reps of that. Then I know that you should be lifting around 70% of that 1 rep max number. So if that 1 rep max number is 100, I'm going to give you 70 pounds on the bar. And that 70 pounds is exactly as many. And that way, like, you should be able to do around 12 reps. I chose 12 reps specifically. That's the target I'm aiming for, because that's going to be in the energy system that I'm aiming for. Now, if I was aiming for a different energy system, let's say I was aiming for, you know, a short duration energy system, I'd say, all right, well, I only want you to do 3 reps. And so then I'd probably want you lifting around 92% of your 1 rep max. So I can't really put 92 pounds on the bar, so I'll probably put 90 pounds on the bar. Or maybe I try to push it and I put 95 on there. And I ask you to do 3 reps, right? So I need to know what your maximal intensity is so that I can make you work at a specific percentage of that. And that's why we have cardiovascular assessments that we're going to talk about later on in this course, right? We're going to look at like what someone's maximal intensity is, and we're going to work at a percentage of that. Now, you obviously need to be able to monitor what their heart rate is like in real time if they're going to work at a percentage. And that is where monitoring your heart rate really comes in. There's sort of two ways that we do this. You're basically going to place two fingers in line with your thumb and your index finger just above the wrist on the left arm. And then that is where you're going to find what is called your radial pulse. Now, if you want to know what that pulse is just in the second, the best way to do it is just to measure it for about 6 seconds and then add a 0 to it. That's the easiest kind of math to do it. And it's very quick, right? So if you're in the middle of a jog and you got a heart stopwatch on you, hit that button, watch it for 6 seconds, count how many beats there are. And if it's around like 5 beats, first off, great. That would be a heart rate of friggin' 50. If you're in the middle of a jog and your heart rate's 50, actually, that's probably not great. But, let's say it's, 17. Well, you add a 0 to that, that person's heart rate is currently 170 beats per minute, which means that person's working pretty freaking hard. So that is what we.
Question.
Oh, yeah. What's up?
So let's say you're running and you're pushing yourself too much and then your ribs start hurting. What does that mean?
So that's a little bit different. So when your ribs hurt, you get those little side stitches, we call them, right? That's a little bit different. That is actually your intercostal muscles. That's actually kind of a breathing problem more than it is a heart problem. The little muscles that are in between each of your ribs, they are expanding and contracting. You are basically breathing into your ribs too much, and it is causing them to cramp up the same way that like any other muscle kind of cramps up when you use it too much. So Kenny, what you need to do, try to focus on breathing more into your stomach, but also the more practice you do, the stronger those muscles are going to get and the less likely they are to cramp. So practice is going to help, but also trying to breathe into your stomach instead of into your rib cage is pretty important. Which is funny because we're going to be talking about that later. We're going to talk about the importance of, we call that diaphragmatic breathing. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, perfectly.
I used to get that. Man, I thought I was like a little hypochondriac when I was in high school. I was a high school freshman, and my health teacher, Miss Marsh, she talked about how she was a softball player, and she collapsed one of her lungs when she was playing softball. She like slid into like third base, I think, but she got slammed, and one of her lungs collapsed. And she described the pain as being worse when you inhale. And then like a week later or something, we were doing like sprints around the track, and I was trying to be really good. I was trying to keep up with this one kid who was just a rock star, and I had the worst side stitch of my life. And I remember being like, I collapsed one of my lungs. And I was so worried. And like, I just remember like internally panicking, and, then I stopped running and I was fine. But very scary at the moment. So that is sort of the first third of our cardiovascular system. Let's go ahead and take a look at our blood here. So can't talk about the cardiovascular system without talking about blood. It's your heart, blood vessels, right? So if we're looking at blood is the medium by which we are going to deliver all of our nutrients. When you look at actual blood, a lot of people think, it looks kind of like it's just kind of nothing but red blood cells. But ironically, only about 45% of your blood is actually red blood cells. So only about 45% of it is actually what is delivering oxygen. And then about 55% of it is what we call plasma, which is mostly water. For the most part, like plasma is just like the water within your blood, which is why if you're having blood pressure problems, try to stay hydrated. It can really help. And then it's, there's gonna be like little proteins in there because proteins got to get delivered throughout the body. Sometimes it'll be electrolytes, which is kind of fun. You'll see like electrolytes in there, which are helping with like metabolism and metabolic functions and stuff. And then we're also seeing a little bit of like gases in there. Your CO2 sometimes will actually be dissolved and it's transported in your plasma along with your blood cells, your red blood cells. And then about 1% of it are your platelets and your leukocytes, your white blood cells. So that's your whole immune system in a bottle right there. Only about 1% of your total volume. So those are kind of like those are kind of sort of the components of blood here. And if you've ever wondered, like somebody who's like anemic, for instance, what they have is they have maybe the same volume of blood. So they don't necessarily have blood pressure problems, but they have very little red blood cells. They have like a lot of water in their blood, but not enough red blood cells. And so they're having trouble making new red blood cells. And that's what anemia is. So looking at blood, right, its job, it acts as a medium by which you are going to collect essential nutrients and deliver those essential nutrients throughout the body. Primarily, the nutrient we're talking about is oxygen, right? Obviously, you're transporting glucose, you're transporting proteins and fats and all kinds of other stuff as well. But for the purposes of today's lecture, the big thing we're talking about is delivering oxygen, right? So you've got about a gallon and a half of blood inside of your body, about 5 liters. You can give away about pretty much a liter of that if you go to donate blood. But any more than that, it starts to get a little bit dangerous, which is why people get really lightheaded when they sometimes donate blood. But it's very important. It transports oxygen, transports hormones, nutrients. It also helps regulate your body temperature by, rushing blood, from areas of like high temperature to low temperature. You're kind of evening things out. It is helping you, which is also why, by the way, stay hydrated. If you have a hard time staying cool or staying warm, either side of the spectrum, stay hydrated. It's very important. It also protects you from injury. This is kind of a weird fun fact. Blood is technically considered connective tissue, weirdly enough, because it is actually able to clot. Your blood cells, your platelets in particular, are very good at sort of like combining together and hardening up your red blood cells and creating what we call a platelet plug, which is, a scab. And that's kind of cool. And then you have immune cells. Your entire immune system is not your entire immune system, but a good chunk of your immune system lives in your blood there. So how is it delivering all these nutrients? Well, like I said, the most important nutrient is going to be hemoglobin. Most important nutrient is going to be oxygen. How do we deliver that oxygen? Well, we do it because red blood cells have a little protein in them called hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is a protein that's present in your blood that binds to oxygen in order to allow for blood cells to carry oxygen to the various tissues of the body. And if you look at hemoglobin actually contains a molecule of iron. So when you look at like what hemoglobin looks like, it's this little kind of squiggly little protein here. You can see, these kind of very weird little squiggles here. Those are representing proteins. I can't, as someone who cannot draw, I love on days where I get to draw proteins because you just go and that's kind of how we represent them most times. And then you'll see here's actually a molecule of iron. And so this is why iron is a very important nutrient for you to consume in your diet. You don't necessarily need a lot of it, but you absolutely need some of it in your diet. When you have a client who has anemia, that's because they cannot make new red blood cells because they are low in iron in their blood. So we use iron to make our new red blood cells. Now, not every animal does that, by the way. I know that's not what it actually is. Blue blood globin. What's that called? Cyanoglobin or something like that. So there are other animals out there that use different elements. Like we use iron, right? Starfish actually use copper, which is why starfish blood is actually blue. If you ever look at the color of it, if you ever see a starfish bleed, it will actually be sort of a bluish color. What is the... There we go. Freaking A. I can never remember the name of this freaking protein. Hemocyanin. There's also green blood out there, chlorocyanin, and then violet blood as well. But you'll see like, different colors of blood. We have red blood. And the reason we have red blood is because we use iron. And when iron attached to oxygen, what happens? It rusts, right? It turns kind of this brightish red color. And that is why your blood is red. And it is never blue at any time inside your body. But copper, if it was copper oxygen, it's probably going to give a picture of the Statue of Liberty. No? Huh. Well, when copper gets oxygenated, it turns blue, which is why Statue of Liberty is blue. Bluish. So anyway, hemoglobin, it's the protein inside of your blood that has a molecule of iron. Iron is what it actually attracts the oxygen molecules. And that is why your red blood cells carry oxygen throughout the body. All right, next thing we're looking at, we got to look at our blood vessels. So we've talked about the pump, we've talked about the vehicle. Now we need to talk about the highways. So how are we actually getting blood to sort of transport around the body? That is where your blood vessels come in. So your blood vessels are a closed circuit of hollow tubes that allow blood to be transported to and from the heart. And you have got two main categories. You have either got arteries or veins, and then you've got kind of the exchange site in the middle, which are going to be your capillaries. So arteries are blood vessels that always eject blood there. It's blood traveling away from the heart. So if blood is traveling away from the heart, it's always an artery. Now, don't make the mistake of thinking that like generally when we think of arteries, we put a lot of emphasis on being like, yeah, okay, like arteries are going away from the heart, therefore it's oxygenated blood that's like going to, my quads and my glutes and my pecs, while I'm working out, it's going to my brain, right? Yeah, absolutely. The arteries that are like sending blood to those areas, you can see here, they're being ejected out, and that's traveling to your liver or your spleen or your kidneys, right? It's all over the place. Now here, it's traveling up to your brain. But there is a deoxygenated carrying type of artery. The arteries that's traveling away from the heart to your lungs. It's a much shorter tube. There's much less sort of a network of deoxygenated arteries, but they still are there. And the same thing is true of veins. Veins are transporting blood back towards the heart. So you can see like once that blood sort of travels out and delivers all that blood to the legs, well, now it's all deoxygenated. So it's got to get back to the heart. So it's going to travel through veins, get back to the heart, and then travel through the arteries again to get to the lungs. And then there are oxygenated veins that head back to the heart. So don't pay attention when you're trying to memorize arteries and veins. Don't pay attention to whether it's like blood that has oxygen in it or blood that doesn't. Pay attention to the direction that they are heading. What's important is that arteries always go away from the heart, veins always go towards the heart. And then in the middle, you are going to have capillaries. Capillaries are microscopic blood vessels that actually form these little beds that cover various tissues throughout the body. This is the actual exchange site for oxygen. If we look at a capillary bed, it sort of looks like this. It's this big webbing that will cover a tissue. Can you get a picture of it covering a tissue instead of just the bed itself? Yeah, that kind of works. So you can see I have no idea what type of tissue we're looking at here, but maybe this is just skin. And you can see, right, there's a whole bunch of like, you know, this little bed here and all these little tiny capillaries that is going to dump little oxygen, you know, blood cells into the area, and then they'll get sucked back in, and then they'll travel, you know, to the heart and stuff. So what's kind of funny is these blood vessels are so small. And by the way, they cover your body like crazy. They absolutely cover your body. You can see here, if anybody's ever been to the bodies exhibit, if you ever get a chance, you should go, guys. It is incredible. It is one of the coolest freaking museum exhibits I have ever seen in my life. And you can actually see, like, they've got this kind of representation of how many blood vessels are absolutely covering you, but that doesn't even do it justice. That's actually not even 100% accurate. There are so many microscopic ones that like they wouldn't be able to like actually sort of create a version like this that covers those tissues even more. So pretty wild stuff. Capillaries are so microscopic. What's weird about capillaries, is that they are sometimes even smaller than your red blood cell. And that seems kind of weird when I say it. You're like, what? How can the tube that the thing is traveling through be smaller than the thing that's traveling through it, right? Like that doesn't seem to make any sense. But capillaries can actually get so small that your blood cells actually have to kind of squeeze. And luckily, you look at the shape of a red blood cell, well, it kind of looks like a little filled in donut. That's actually pretty easy to kind of fold in half. And so that little tiny squeeze that it experienced causes it to kind of get a little pressure built up and then kind of pops through to the other side, which is great because now it has a lot of force, which could, you know, actually force it to kind of squeeze and pop back through on the other side when it's time to start heading back to the heart. So what's funny here is your capillaries are sometimes smaller than the blood vessels. And what that does is that actually sort of creates a little bit of pressure of its own, which makes it easier for blood to travel back to the heart. Because a lot of times you're standing up and it's pretty hard to, you know, gravity blood from your feet back to your heart. It's got to work directly against gravity. So you get a little bit of bonus pressure by doing that. There we go. This is exactly what I was looking for. You can kind of see here's like a capillary bed kind of covering a tissue, right? Now, you'll notice I've got two other little definitions here. There are sort of small versions of arteries. As an artery is branching down smaller and smaller and smaller before it becomes a capillary, we'll call it an arteriole. You know, an arteriole is basically a blood vessel that branches away off of an artery. It's the miniature version of an artery. You have the same thing in venules. Venules are basically smaller versions of veins. But honestly, you know, you're not going to probably see those terms. Arteries to capillaries to veins, okay? And by the way, there's always a homework question that a lot of people tend to struggle with, which is like, which of the following would be, which of the following blood vessels has the thinnest walls? That question seems tricky because it's like, I don't know which one has the thinnest walls. But if you think about like the fact that capillaries are microscopic as it is, the tube is smaller. Therefore, the wall is thinner. So that answer is simpler than people tend to make it. But your capillaries have really thin walls. And the reason they're making that point is because that's why it's so easy to bruise, you know? You smack yourself, you break a bunch of capillaries, those capillaries leak all their blood into the area. You see that blood pooling under your skin, and that's what you're seeing when you see a bruise. So when you look at them, this is sort of what they look like in terms of size, right? You can see arteries are really, really big with these really thick walls. Veins also pretty big, but they don't need the thick walls because the pressure is not quite as high. Obviously, pressure in an artery is going to be much, much higher than pressure in a vein. because like, your blood cell, your blood just contracted, right? So there's a lot of pressure there. And arterial is much smaller, which is mostly wall. Capillaries, really tiny, really itty bitty, absolutely tiny. And then like in a venule, you can see, a little bit thicker, and then it goes back to a vein. But we need these to have thicker walls because the pressure is just so much higher in an artery than it is in a vein, because, your heart just got done contracting. And that is your cardiovascular system. Any questions on blood vessels, or the heart? Anything? All righty. So let's take a look here at the respiratory system. So your respiratory system, its primary role, which is kind of funny, is we always say it's to ensure proper cellular functioning, which it seems kind of weird because you're like, cellular functioning? I thought it was in charge of just getting oxygen in the body, right? Well, that's what cellular functioning is. Your cells cannot function without oxygen. Most of the things that will kill us is due to lack of oxygen delivery. When you think about like you can live without your left arm, but if you get your left arm cut off violently and you are leaking massive amounts of blood, your heart can no longer maintain pressure, which means it can no longer deliver oxygen effectively throughout the body. So really what killed you is either lack of blood pressure or lack of oxygen. Respiratory system really does ensure proper cellular function, because it is how we are getting oxygen extracted from the environment into our body. Used to be you could passively do this, back when you go back up the evolutionary line, when everyone was like like an amphibian or a fish or something, you could absorb oxygen pretty passively. It would just kind of come straight through your skin. But as an organism got more complicated, which we are very complicated, we need to have a different way to get oxygen in. And so we created this sort of internal environment that gets a lot of oxygen in by creating a bulk flow of nutrients here. So again, the primary role here is to gather oxygen from the environment. So we're going to go ahead and divide your respiratory system into two primary divisions. You have got your respiratory pump, which is in charge of like creating pressure, and your respiratory passageways, which are actually where the gases are traveling and being exchanged. So you can kind of see here your respiratory part of your respiratory pump, because you can see like here's your lungs, right? And then you would have your rib cage covering this. But you could also see all of the respiratory passageways, which are these little branches that get smaller and smaller and smaller. And then eventually they're covered in little capillaries and capillary beds. And that is where, the outside environment is sort of interacting with the inside environment. So if we look at what your respiratory pump is, it's located in your thoracic cavity, it's your rib cage. It's responsible for providing a framework and flexibility that allows for ventilation. So it is actually like the muscles and framework that allow for your lungs to be able to contract and expand. And that's a very important thing, because like when your lungs contract, when they push down like this, that creates so much pressure inside of your lungs that there is more pressure in your chest cavity than there is pressure in the atmosphere. And one thing that is true about the universe, remember I said a couple days ago, my favorite phrase that I always tell people, form follows function. If you want to understand how anything in the universe works, understand that form follows function. You remember that? You'll understand literally everything a little bit better. Well, one other thing that you should remember, if you want to understand how sort of nature works a little bit better, remember this: nature hates gradients. Nature is 100% a socialist. It wants everything to be even on both sides. It wants there to be an equal amount of stuff here and an equal amount of stuff here, right? That is how nature is. So when there's a lot of stuff over here and very little stuff over here, nature will naturally move stuff until those balance out. Well, if your lungs contract, and that creates a lot of internal pressure, and there's a greater amount of pressure in here, well, now you've created a pressure gradient. You have way too much oxygen here, more so than there is oxygen out here in the atmosphere. So what'll happen is that air will rush out of your lungs. Now, you've created an area of low pressure, because what's going to happen is you're going to expand your lungs. Your respiratory pump is going to open up. And when that happens, there's such a little amount of pressure over here. Nature is like, oh, gross, right? And it's going to rush air into the lungs. And that is how ventilation or breathing works, right? You've got inspiration, which is the inhalation that drives gas into the lungs. You're creating an area of low pressure. And you've got expiration, which is exhalation or the expelling of gases from the lungs. You're creating an area of high pressure. And so that pressure gradient is what moves things around. And so there's some bones here, but there's also a lot of muscles that are really doing this. The bones that are going to kind of passively allow this to happen pretty easily are going to be your sternum, that is your breastbone, your rib cage, and parts of your vertebrae, right? And those bones are there to not only protect these delicate lungs, but they're also there to be kind of heavy, which is a good thing, because if I take a big deep breath in and my big heavy lungs, my big heavy like bones, they want to naturally kind of, gravity is going to kind of push on the lung, and that actually drives that out. And this is why it's so easy for us to keep breathing when we are sleeping. All you have to do really is focus on breathing in. As long as you're doing that effectively, the breathing out will happen naturally for you. But obviously there are muscles that are making all of this happen. How do we move those freaking bones around? Those are where your muscles come in. And so the other part of your respiratory pump, you've got your inspiratory and your expiratory muscles here. The main muscle is going to be your diaphragm. And if you look at your diaphragm, it is this kind of dome-shaped, actually, this is a great picture. Here it is. You're looking at a top view here, which is kind of funny. This is a weird view that we don't normally see when we look at the diaphragm. But you can see, like, here's a tube, right? Those are your blood vessels traveling through this muscle. There's your esophagus traveling through this muscle. There's some more blood vessels. And then there's your ribcage. And so kind of funny looking, but what it normally looks like when we look at it is this right here. It's this kind of dome-shaped muscle that looks like this. And that dome rests in a position kind of like this. And when it contracts, it flattens down. So it rests in this position and contracts down to this position here. What that does is that it's attached to the very bottom of your lungs. We can see that here. And when this flattens down, it's kind of like, imagine if you had like a paper sack and it was kind of crumpled up, and then you grabbed the bottom of the sack and pulled on it. You draw the sack open, right? You'd be trying to kind of like expand it a little bit, right? Well, that's exactly what your diaphragm does. It literally pulls your lungs open. So this big empty sack draws open. What does that mean? It creates an area of low pressure. That's what causes air to rush into your lungs. So your diaphragm will flatten down like this. That will cause air to rush into the lungs. And that is how you are delivering a bulk flow of oxygen. Sorry, this is a student. That bulk flow of oxygen now can be exposed to all of your blood cells and your blood vessels, and now it can get delivered there. There are some helper muscles here as well. Your external intercostals, for instance, are actually very important in the process of breathing. Kenny, this is exactly what we were talking about earlier. When you look at these little muscles right here, your intercostals, they're all these little tiny muscles that are in between each of your individual rib cages, right? So those are our, little muscles there. And there's two layers of it. There's an internal and an external layer, and they are they are sort of creating like a zigzag motion that allows them to kind of pull in both directions. So those are your external intercostals there. They are going to help with breathing in. Now, there are a couple other muscles here that are secondary helper muscles that really shouldn't be doing that much work, but they do some work. That is going to be your scalenes, your sternocleidomastoid, and your pectoralis minor. So your scalenes are this little neck muscle that lives underneath your trapezius muscles. Your sternocleidomastoid is this neck muscle right here in the front. You can kind of feel this thick muscle right here. And your pec minor, which is this little muscle that lives underneath your pec major, lives underneath your pecs, and attaches to your scapula. So those three muscles actually kind of assist with breathing, but they really shouldn't be primarily responsible for breathing. If you are mostly using those three muscles or your external intercostal, if you're using anything other than your diaphragm for most of your breathing, chances are you are tightening up those muscles. Now, it's not that big a deal, except that your scalenes also work with your traps to elevate your shoulders. Your sternocleidomastoid works to pull your head forward, and your pec minor works to round your shoulders like this. So if you're breathing like this, using those secondary respiratory muscles, those muscles are contracting and they're getting stronger and they're getting tighter, which means you might have altered posture. And now you cannot use your diaphragm the way you're supposed to. You can't use your diaphragm effectively. And now you have altered breathing patterns, you have poor posture, and you probably have things like tension headaches. You're creating more stress hormones and things like that. Let's take a look at the other side of things. We do have expiration as well, obviously, like the breathing out. That is actually the relaxation. It doesn't take very much muscle to breathe out. In fact, your bones resting back like gravity, because they're heavy, actually do most of the breathing out for you. So inspiration is a very active phase, right? This is something that you are contracting muscles to do, but expiration is kind of just a passive relaxation. That is, it kind of passively happens. Now, obviously you can go and breathe a little bit harder, which is like where your internal intercostals will come in, or your abdominals. That's why your stomach pooches out when you breathe really hard and you're blowing out like birthday candles or something. So for those of you from the last mod, do you remember how we were just talking about the Valsalva maneuver the other day, right? I wonder if I can find a picture of this. If you look at your Valsalva maneuver, it is where you basically exhale while you are doing like a big heavy lift, but you don't just like exhale. You actually exhale forcefully and you try to resist exhaling. You close your mouth down. And so you go like that. And you'll notice what that does, that causes your stomach to pooch out. That contracts your abdominal muscles, which are those secondary expiratory muscles. Well, they also are muscles that are used to stabilize your spine. So if you want to create a little bit of extra spinal stability, exhaling hard while pursing your lips a little bit will actually activate your core. And it's a really good technique that helps during heavy lifting. Now, I will say, if you have blood pressure problems, if you have high blood pressure or anything like that, you should not do the Valsalva maneuver because what this does is it also elevates your blood pressure. But if your goal is, if you have normal blood pressure and your goal is just to get your muscles nice and active, go for it. Valsalva maneuver away. It's a really good method. Now, so that's your respiratory pump. Those are all the things that are creating these areas of high and low pressure. They're pumping oxygen into and out of the lungs. Well, we also have our respiratory passageways. Our respiratory passageways are passageways that allow gases to be able to travel into and out of the lungs, right? So there's sort of two aspects of this. There's the conduction passageways, and then there's the actual like respiration part of things. Your conduction passageways are probably what you're imagining. It's your nose, your mouth, right? The tubes that connect those, like your pharynx and larynx. It's your trachea, this tube right here. And it's both branches of the trachea that branch out into what are called your bronchi. So when you look at this, you'll see like, you've got, like I said, the larynx and the pharynx, and then that is going to branch down. Here's your trachea. It'll branch out into the left and the right bronchi. And then what that'll do is that'll branch into even smaller, what we call bronchioles. So the main ones here, the trachea, the bronchi, and the bronchioles. Just like we had like veins and we had venules, we had arteries, and we had arterioles, we have bronchi, which are big tubes, and we have the bronchioles, which are all the little tubes that are branching off from that. So again, if we look at the bodies exhibit here, you can actually see here's like these big branches, and then they break into all of these little tiny individual like pieces there, right? There's with the heart in the middle. So, we're not seeing the overall outer layer of the lung here. We're not seeing the outer sac layer, which would look something kind of like this. We're seeing this version here, but it branches out smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Eventually, though, those bronchioles will end in these little itty bitty sacs at the very end. And so each bronchi will kind of, at its terminal part, come to an end, and it'll end in this little, sort of looks like popcorn, right? These little popcorn shaped sacs. Those are your respiratory passageways, right? So that is these little sacs, we call those alveoli. So these little alveoli, these little alveolar sacs, they are covered in blood vessels. And that is where your cardiovascular system is working very intimately with your respiratory system. It is going to drop off CO2, and it's going to pick up oxygen. And that's how we get waste products out of our lungs, and we get nutrients back into our lungs, right? It's this constant breathe in, breathe out process, right? So that is what we are seeing in those passageways. Any questions on that so far, guys? All the anatomy there pretty clear? Radio silence, all right. All right, next section. We are looking at our cardiorespiratory function. So we looked at we said we looked at the heart's anatomy, and then we looked at the function of the heart. That's your cardiac output, right? Heart rate times stroke volume. Well, you kind of have a similar situation happening here in your respiratory system. So in general, this is where we have to look at like how your respiratory system is getting oxygen. I mean, you can bring in literally trillions of oxygen molecules, right? You are bringing in so many oxygen molecules every time you breathe in, but you can only extract so many of them into your blood cells. We only have so much like hemoglobin available in these red blood cells. So your resting oxygen consumption will be about 3.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of your body weight when you are at rest. So when you're at rest, the amount of oxygen that you need is about 3.5 milliliters per kilogram of oxygen. So, let's see, if I weigh 179 pounds, what just happened here? Then I'm about 81 kilograms, right? So if I take 81 and I open up a calculator, which should happen quickly. And I, if I take that and I multiply that by 3.5, I consume about 284 milliliters of oxygen per minute when I am sleeping. When I am perfectly at rest and I am doing as little energy as possible. The bare minimum amount of oxygen that it takes to keep me alive is about 284 milliliters of oxygen per minute. That would be about this much, this much oxygen per minute. So, that's actually not very much, but the problem is I don't spend all my time sleeping, right? Obviously, like I'm very, very active. So if I am doing, let's say, twice as much activity if I'm burning twice as many calories as I would be while sleeping, well, then I would be consuming 7 milliliters of oxygen per minute. If I were doing 3 times as much energy, I'd be consuming 10.5 milliliters of oxygen, 4 times as much, right? And so that is what we measure in what is called a MET, or a metabolic equivalent. A metabolic equivalent is 3.5 milliliters of O2 per kilogram of body weight per minute. And METs are really handy if you need to figure out exactly how much oxygen someone is consuming over the course of like a race. And it's very handy if you're sending people into space, and you need to be able to like, hey, how much oxygen should we pack for this journey, right? Like, well, how much do the astronauts weigh? How much activity do they do in a day, and that's how they're going to kind of figure that out. So, when you think about like what a metabolic equivalent is, it's how many calories you'd be burning or how much energy you'd be burning when you are perfectly at rest. And so it's kind of fun when you get on a treadmill and it's like, hey, you burned 7 METs worth of energy over the last 20 minutes. Well, that's kind of cool because you're like, all right, well, in that 7 minutes or in that 20 minutes, I burned 7 times as many calories as I would have if I were just like, at home taking a nap right now. So that's kind of motivating. And you can see like different METs of activities. You can see there's like different METs out there depending on what you're doing. By the way, 7's actually pretty freaking high. That's some pretty intense exercise. But you can see like, sweeping your carpet with a vacuum cleaner. Cool picture. That's about 3.3 METs. Gardening is about 4 METs. Playing with your dog is about 4 METs. I don't know why washing your car. Like playing with the dog is so much harder than washing your car, but I guess that's 4.5. All kind of interesting things here, right? So, and then we can see, we got soccer up here with 10 freaking METs. Yeah, 7 METs is about equivalent to like hiking. And here you can see soccer, that's friggin' pretty intense, right? Because you're basically sprinting. So kind of a fun way to sort of measure things out. I always like to think of it as like sort of a motivating factor. Love to explain to my clients like, hey, you could have burned way less calories right now than if you were at the gym. But METs are not exactly a super applicable way. They're kind of a heady concept. Sometimes clients have a hard time sort of visualizing how METs work. And so it's not always the best way to measure your breathing. Probably the best way to measure your breathing efficiency is going to be what is called your VO2 max. And so your VO2 max, or your volume of oxygen consumed maximally, is the maximum amount of oxygen that you can consume in general. And so this is generally the best way to gauge cardiorespiratory fitness. Like if we're trying to figure out like how good of shape someone is in, we can absolutely do our heart rate tests. We can do our walking assessments and all of those things. But if you want the best of the best, what you should do is do a VO2 max assessment. And so the Rockport walk test is not bad at doing this, but it is only using math to do it. It's a calculation. If you want a true estimate of your VO2 max, I recommend you go do one of these tests here where they actually kind of hook you up to this big uncomfortable machine. And what this machine is doing is it's measuring how much, this is an intake valve here. It's measuring how much oxygen is coming in versus how much oxygen is coming out. If I brought in 10 units of oxygen and I exhaled 9 units of CO2, well, then I'm only exhaling 1 unit of oxygen, which means I'm consuming 90% of the oxygen that comes into my body, right? So that's what a VO2 max test is. It's actually going to measure how well you are consuming oxygen. And so when you think about the fact that like your muscles consume oxygen for energy, and you think that your red blood cells carry oxygen, right? Both of those things, that means that you are consuming, you're using that oxygen, you're exchanging oxygen for CO2. You're burning up the O2, you're using it to produce energy, and you are being left with CO2, right? So that means you consumed it. The more you can consume, the better shape you are in, because that means you have more red blood cells, more hemoglobin, and more muscle that is eating all of that oxygen, right? So we want our VO2 max score to be as high as possible. This is one of the reasons why we do that Walkport rock test. This is a good thing for you guys to test on yourselves. If you've been doing like cardiovascular exercise, if you've been doing cardiovascular exercise for a couple of weeks and you want to test to see like if you're improving, like let's say we got a 45-year-old client who weighs 200 pounds and their heart rate was 150, and it took them 14 minutes and 12 seconds to complete their VO2 test. They get a pretty average score. It's not bad, right? They can consume about 36, right, units of oxygen. So their VO2 max is about 36. They can, get up to a maximum of about 10 METs at a time. Pretty good, right? Pretty freaking good. But let's just say they drop that down to 13, right? And then their heart rate's like 140, right? They get in a little bit of better shape, right? They maybe drop 10 pounds. They've been doing exercise like crazy. Well, that's still going to put them in the average category, but now they went from 40 up to 42. So their VO2 max improved a little bit. And it's like, hey, this cardio program is working, right? Let's say they get that down to 12 minutes. Now they are killing it. They're excellent. Their VO2 max is all the way up to 45. And that means we can give them a really tough workout. They can get up to almost 13 METs, right? They can push themselves 13 times as hard as baseline rest, right? That's pretty freaking good. So that's why we like VO2 max as an assessment. If it's not convenient to do the Rockport walk test, like I said, you can always do the YMCA step test. But in this course, we're going to be going over all of them. We want to make sure you guys know how to basically do all these different assessments. So last thing we're going to look at here, like I said earlier, this is kind of coming back to the idea, kind of tying everything together in this sort of assessments class. And this is where your cardiorespiratory system meets your posture. There are dysfunctional breathing patterns. Alterations in your breathing patterns can lead to inefficiencies, not only in energy production, but also in further altering your posture. So shallow breathing patterns in particular tend to rely on your secondary respiratory muscles, those intercostal muscles, the scalenes, the sternocleidomastoid, the levator scapulae, which wasn't on their list, but it's on a lot of people's lists, and your pectoralis minor, right? All of those muscles that also do postural stuff, right? My levator scapula does this. My scalenes do this. My pec minor does that. My sternocleidomastoid does that. If you use those secondary muscles and they start to develop overactivity, well, now they're not going to be able to relax. So what you're often going to do is this will lead to upper chest breathing, which activates the SCM, levator, scalenes, upper traps. All those muscles start to become overactive. So you start to become a breather like this. And that leads to tension headaches. It leads to shoulder dysfunction. It can lead to heart problems. It can lead to cardiorespiratory problems, shortness of breath. It leads to creating more stress hormones, all negative stuff, right? It alters our posture. And that alterations in posture leads to physiologic dysfunction, right? Biomechanic dysfunction in terms of like how you're supposed to move, lightheadedness, headaches, all of those things. We do not want to spend our time only doing chest breathing. We want to teach our clients to breathe into their stomach. I know it's not flattering. I know it means you're going to pooch your stomach out, but it is how we are meant to breathe. And it is a very important way to learn. So kind of circling all the way back, Kenny, if you're getting those side stitches, try to send your breath a little bit lower. Try to breathe into your stomach. It'll have a really, really, really positive effect. And work on, loosening up that posture, right? Stretch out those scalenes, stretch out that pectoralis minor, stretch out those muscles, and that's going to have a positive effect as well. So it's kind of funny, right? Like we ended up circling back around to, we've been talking about physiology all day, but we kind of circled back around to posture again, which is a big focus of this, 12-day course. All right, so summarizing everything up, your respiratory system is in charge of gathering oxygen from the environment so that it can get it exposed to your cardiovascular system. And then your cardiovascular system is going to deliver that oxygen throughout the body. That will allow your cells to use that oxygen and produce carbon dioxide or CO2 as a byproduct. Then we got to be able to get that byproduct out of the body, and that's what your heart and lungs are responsible for as well. And so that deoxygenated blood will travel back to the heart, where it'll get pushed back to the lungs, and then the lungs will trade CO2 for oxygen, and the process will repeat. The collection and transportation of that is made possible thanks to your respiratory pump and your respiratory passageways. And if there's any dysfunction in your cardiorespiratory system, right, if your heart and lungs don't work efficiently, it is going to cause dysfunction throughout the rest of the body. Your brain can't work as well. Your muscles obviously can't work as well. Your digestive system can't work as well. All of these things are really, really important. This is why, we tell our clients, like, it is important to exercise, have a healthy diet, keep that heart healthy, and avoid things like smoking so you can keep those lungs healthy. And that is what we've got for the day. Any questions, guys? How y'all feeling?
Feeling good. That was good stuff.
Good. Yeah, it was.
Cool.
Love it.
It's been a while, we've been really doing a lot of like biomechanic conversations lately, so it's kind of nice to get back into the phys. Bay, Isaiah, Jerica, Kenny, you guys got any questions for me? You guys all feeling good?
Great.
All righty, very cool. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and kill the recording, and